and then today we're going to be talking specifically about the player power creep and the approach that GG is taking to rebalance players in 3.15. I will be making separate videos to talk about what I think about the upcoming league, but this video is going to be focused all around this. Now, before we get into it, I think there's something very important that we need to consider. Regardless of if you're for these changes or against these changes, it's worth recognizing that this is going to be very divisive. And there's a lot of players who started playing Path of Exile in this window of the game and this window of the game who have very different points of view based on when they started playing. I will also say I have a lot of sympathy for players who either started playing Path of Exile or who enjoy Path of Exile most at an extreme power level and are worried that these changes might potentially ruin their favorite game. I think not enough talk is given when it comes to live service games and game archival as a system. There are lots of players like me who started playing in the beta who much preferred the slower pace and for years have longed for a return to the slower pace. So for us, this is great news because while we enjoy modern day PoE, there's the hope that we're going to get something back to what used to be our favorite. But I am very aware that for a lot of people, this is spelling doom for them, because this is going in the opposite direction and this could make their game experience less fun. And I think it's important to recognize both of those points of view. Before I go into the specifics though, I also think it is worth recognizing the fact that whether you agree with it or not, GGG wants to go backwards. They want to go back to a slower, more considered game experience. And I think even if you don't agree with the changes, that you recognize, I think it's better for the whole that GGG is designing towards the game they want to make rather than continuing down a path they're not happy with for the sake of, appeasing players. Because it would be much easier for them to just stay on the same trajectory and just keep going, right, this is the way we're going, we'll just keep getting stronger and stronger, we'll just keep scaling up the new content and just having these crazy imbalances. Regardless of if you like the current system or you dislike the current system, you can all agree that it's pretty laughable the difference between just a vanilla white monster in a map and then a white monster from a new league mechanic. Like, it's completely night and day. And for me, the way that I see these changes kind of going is they want basically the vast majority of the game to feel kind of like league content rather than just vanilla content. Does that kind of make sense? And as someone who was fortunate enough to get to play the PoE 2 demo in New Zealand, I loved what I played, and my biggest concern has always been, I loved what I played, I saw how passionate the devs were about this really challenging experience they made, and there was like a real concern that they wouldn't get to make that content. So to see that we're actually moving in that direction is something that I am personally very much looking forward to. So now let's talk about the actual changes they're doing, if I agree with them, and if I think it's going to have the result that they want and that players want. I think it's also worth noting that this is going to be an ongoing process, and this is just the tip. I imagine that things are going to be much more severe in terms of nerfs. So if these initial nerfs, like hearing stuff like support gems being 40% weaker in some cases, if that scares you, I would prepare, because there's going to be a lot more of that going forward with each league. And PoE 2 is still many years out. I would say Q4 2023 at the soonest, but anyway, there's a long road ahead of us. So what are they actually doing? They are rebalancing Act 1. They're planning on rebalancing all future acts. Basically, each league they'll rebalance a new act. They're changing how the skills work on some enemies. They're introducing new enemies. They're changing enemy behavior. One thing which stood out as being quite interesting is they're significantly reducing aggro range on enemies in Act 1, but then making the fights more engaging. Chris talked about Hail Rake actually having abilities that instead of targeting the player, they target where the player will be. There were a lot of bosses which had that sort of aiming in PoE 2, and it made it a much more interesting system. It did also initially make it a system of being... I thought I was like desyncing, because I'm like, wait, why did that hit me? I dodged that, and then I'm like, wait, oh, it's leading. Like, it will take a while to adjust to that mindset. They're also increasing movement speed for some monsters, because there are currently no monsters in Act 1 faster than the player, or even really the same speed as the player. And Chris said they're experimenting with having some maybe 20-40% faster than the base movement speed. So that'll be very interesting. So what do I think is actually going to happen from nerfing a bunch of core systems? We haven't even seen the balance manifesto yet. I'm sure in the patch note there'll be much more, you know. I made a video recently talking about defenses. I would expect some of those things to slip in there. There will definitely be some builds that I think will kind of be left by the roadside from these changes. I would hope they'll be brought back up at a later date. But naturally, if you're just going to make sweeping mass changes like this, if we are going to reduce the power level of support gems by up to 40% in some cases, there will be some skills that were just kind of like skirting along. And by losing all the support, if those skills then don't get buffed up to compensate, like they won't be stronger than they were before, but they don't like even out to some degree, they might suffer. I worry a little bit about some of the Chaos Dot builds. Chaos Dot builds have always been very strong. They've always been able to like just do enough damage. But those builds are often very dependent on just using full damage support gems and not actually using many utility gems. The builds that used to use a lot of utility gems will benefit the most from these changes. So funnily enough, traps will actually be potentially quite powerful going into the next patch, since they'll be impacted potentially the least. So what I mean by that is if you were using a skill which just straight up used 5 pure damage support gems, and each support gem saw massive nerfs, and obviously you got hit really hard. Whereas if you were using a skill which used lots of stuff like Ancestral Call, GMP, Trap Support, Cluster Trap, Charged Mines, multiple totems, increased AoE, I think I already said that, but like those kind of support gems, Mirage Archer, those will be impacted less. So if you have any builds that you particularly enjoy that use 2 to 3 utility gems, they're going to be looking a hell of a lot stronger. So yeah, Trap Support Gem with Cluster Traps, maybe Swift Assembly and Charge Traps, that might actually not really get touched that much. So that'll be interesting definitely to see. Now, what impact do I actually think this is going to have on players? It's definitely going to take some time to adjust to. We've seen big changes like this before, and it always takes players some time to adjust. If you are someone who likes to go fast and you're all about the zoom and you play Path of Exile because you just want to be a zoomer and that's all you care about, there will still be builds that do that. There will always be builds that do that. It's nearly impossible for GGG to stop that from being a thing. Whatever happens with the new league, whatever build Steel is playing will be a gotta go fast build. Unless they actually change how attack speed works in this game, you'll always be able to make crazy Elite Slam speed builds, which do crazy scaling. With the way that Path of Exile is currently, that's probably my biggest concern with these changes. By making the changes so just general in we're just like hitting random support gems, the builds before that were doing 100 million damage, well, you lose 40%, they're still doing 60 million damage. Like, they're still absolutely dumpstering. Whereas if your build was barely doing 1 mil and now you've gone down to 600k, you're obviously going to feel that a lot more. If you're overkilling every single enemy, it doesn't matter if you lose 40% of your damage. So, you know, I can understand some of that initial concern of people who play very casually or people who play just for fun meme builds, they might suffer. The reply to that, I think, is I feel like that's kind of the pacing that GGG wants the game anyway. And one thing I did find kind of funny is in some of the promo footage they were showing, talk about like, this is an example of like clear speed gone too far. And they showed a Wander character and they showed a Bow character. The builds were fast, but they weren't actually that fast. Like, if you were to show that to the standard softcore trade league YouTubers who just like make videos on how to get the most money from your fully segmented maps, they'd look at that and be like, I mean, I guess that's okay. Like, you know, they'd be like, yeah, this was right. And I guess with that, we'll talk about the Flask rework that's happening as well. I'm very pleased that they're touching Flask. I made a video this league talk about the whole Flask situation. You're welcome, by the way, because in that video I said that they won't do Flasks, but if they do, they'll do it to prove me wrong, so you're welcome. And if they don't, I'm right. That's a win-win kind of video, so you're welcome on that one. The Flask rework does worry me a little bit. So I like the idea behind it. So basically what they're doing is they're making Flask generation severely weaker in maps. They've cut it by, I think Chris said, up to 3/4 in some cases. And they've also nerfed the power level of specific Flasks. That I think is fine. They then introduced these 2 new types of currency, which if you use on a Flask will change how the Flask works. You can have one which will activate on a certain trigger. So for example, when you are frozen, the flask will activate, or when you are stunned, ignited, triggers. And then there's another one which will make the flask significantly stronger, kind of back to the current strength of flasks, but they won't gain charges while the flask is active. So I like the idea behind this, but I have a serious issue with it. So by tying this mechanic to an orb, if the orbs are rare to any degree, you've bricked the system. They're adding friction to a new system that players are already going to be hesitant to. Players are used to the current strength of flasks. Flasks are becoming weaker numerically. Even if they didn't change how charges worked, your flasks will be worse going to the next patch. That will upset some players. They're then also making it harder to maintain your flask. That will upset some players. This talk that this flask system will reduce player input, I don't necessarily believe that will be the case. I'll have to wait to play it. I have to wait and see, obviously. But this idea that, oh, it's fine because you can just get all of these instant trigger flasks. So if you want to reduce input, as someone who does regularly suffer from RSI, that's very attractive to me. By tying it to an RNG system or tied to an orb, you've basically created a solution and then hidden it. You've hidden it behind all these layers of content. So let's say, for example, that I am leveling through the axe and I'm using temporary flasks. If this new orb that drops costs a divine orb, would I use that on a leveling flask? Hell no. Of course I wouldn't. Okay, so let's say it costs 5 chaos orbs. Would I use 5 chaos orbs? Maybe. If it costs 1 chaos orb, sure. But these can be incredibly, incredibly popular. Everyone's going to be wanting to use these, so I imagine they're going to have a certain cost to them. And they're an RNG-based system. So getting the random instant trigger, right? So let's say that I've rolled a Stibnite Flask to have freeze removal. So obviously I want the Stibnite Flask to be used when I am frozen. I use the orb on it, and I hit, this flask will trigger when you are shocked. I don't need a freeze removal flask when I'm shocked. I need a freeze removal flask when I am frozen. It would be a much simpler system, in my mind, if it worked like Einhar, or if it worked like the Syndicate bench, where it costs the orb and you choose the modifier. I think it's much better that you get players used to this new system by giving them full control, rather than tying it to RNG. There's already RNG through alterations to roll your flasks. GGG correctly assessed that was frustrating for a lot of players, so they made it easier to roll flasks through bestiary. So they saw a problem, solved the problem, and now they've reintroduced the original problem. So that all seems a bit peculiar to me. Again, I have to wait and see. This could just be pure fear-mongering on my part. That's probably a bit of a heated word, but it is a system that worries me a little bit. And I know that Ziggy had the exact same thoughts. And I think, as a general rule of thumb, if I think something, well, I'm an idiot. But if Ziggy thinks something, I mean, Ziggy can sometimes also be an idiot. But the chance that we're both being an idiot about the same thing, I mean, yeah, probably. But you get what I mean, right? If that was both our initial reactions, then it makes me go, not too sure about that one. But yeah, so the flask thing, I'm not too sure about. But in terms of the general trying to go back to a older school approach to Path of Exile is something I'm fully in favor of. I'm really looking forward to seeing how it plays out. The people who love the current state of Path of Exile, and this is the worst news, you have my absolute sympathy. It really is a shame that with the way that live service games work, you can have your favorite version of a game unplayable. Even with non-live service games, with the current state of digital game ownership, you can lose access to your favorite game. We're constantly seeing servers being pulled. It's something which does actually need to be addressed wider in the community, across all genres. But anyway, I'm Tarke. Have a good day. Let me know what you think about this power rebalancing. Have a good day. Bye-bye.